Welcome. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Ed Bice. I'm the CEO of the Medan Project, and very pleased to be here today to discuss this most fascinating issue of how we actually support the collaborations that will define global education going forward. So I'm going to offer some introductory remarks now, which I hope will frame the next hour and 15 minutes. I'll then ask my panelists to come up and join me on the stage. At that point, I'll introduce them. And then each of them will offer some introductory remarks. And then we'll invite the audience to add to the list of questions that we've prepared, and we also invite you to use Twitter or MyWise to submit questions online. I believe that I will be given an iPad up here, which I assume is not mine to take away, but I'll be looking at questions coming in online and filtering those. And so the ideal here is that this conversation embodies the sort of digital and global educational conversation that we're here to discuss. Just briefly, I'm standing here today because my organization has been working for the last several years on this issue of how we move knowledge between communities online. And when we talk about the boundaries between communities, the most obvious is language. Medan.org works on platforms for partners like Cambridge, QFI, which is the DC-based cross-cultural education organization supported by Qatar Foundation, IIE, Kiva.org, Caxt, Wikipedia, and other partners that all have an interest in generating language-crossing interactions. So very grateful to the Qatar Foundation, not only for their support of our project, but also for this incredible convening here today. So in deference to the educators in the room, I'm going to start with setting some learning objectives for the session. And recognizing that in framing thusly, you all might end up scurrying for the door thinking there's going to be an exam at the end. Let me assert that there are two aspects of learning: what is learned and how we learn. And so the objectives I propose are concerned with the latter. And this is a matter of how we learn, which lends itself to the questions of the affordances and opportunities presented with digital tools and environments. I would further refine that our learning objective today is not going to focus on the GUIs and databases and ICTs that we use or that we will be discussing today. I would rather say that it is that elemental and fundamental building block that connects all learning moments. The most ineffable, intangible, and indefinable stuff that resides at the core of any successful aha moment, any successful moment of learning, and that's inspiration. So the learning objective for this next hour and 15 minutes is to inspire you. In that regard, my job as a chair of this panel has been made extraordinarily easy. I think in some regards I've already succeeded. We have with us today three of the most inspiring thinkers in the global education movement. Richard, Catherine, and Ilka are three of the individuals who are truly moving global education forward into the open and digital setting. So now, having established the proposed learning outcome, I suggest that we make this objective itself also the focus of our discussion, at least a central theme to which we might return. And this seems especially appropriate given the spot in both geographically and at this moment of history that we occupy. Given the historic events across the region over the past year, it's appropriate to discuss inspiration itself as a pedagogical imperative. Global collaboration through education software as fundamentally revolutionary. So, I'd like to discuss a bit about how this revolution might transition to constructive improvement in society. This consideration is at the heart of any innovation process, be it social or educational. As we consider how to innovate in education technologies and practices, we must consider how our revolutionary proclamations are going to play in the classrooms of the world and on the streets of the world. How can they meaningfully evolve existing educational systems and practices? As my fellow panelist Ilka Tuomi says, innovation requires a careful balance between stability and change. So with what revolutions in the world and in our educational practices, this dance between stability and change is imprecise, messy, more poetic than mathematical. However, taking the opportunity presented to me, I'll assert the following as imperatives that guide us on this path. First, we must think about innovating the very form of the text. This idea that knowledge is contextual should not remain a philosophical observation. Rather, as we think about the technologies that are going to embody and empower the next generation of learners, we need to think about tools that allow OERs to be deeply contextualized. We must allow knowledge to be created in the thousand tellings of a place or an event or a movement. This is not coming through one lens, it's coming through many. And I would say that the wiki has been profound, but this is a paradigm that supports a single version of knowledge, and that as we think about innovating educational platforms appropriate to the next generation, we will move past the wiki. And I'd also put forward a second imperative, and that's that we not think of language and access via language as a secondary thought. This needs to be foremost in the design of any platform. As we work to globalize OERs, we must think about access and authoring tools that support multilingual OERs. Lastly, I would say, and then I'll bring the panelists up to really discuss the meat of the issues. This generation can be thought of as the read-write generation, I think. With the combination of this read-write generation, the rise of open access education resources, and the next era of globalization wherein individuals and not simply markets are connected, we have a wonderful opportunity for true global education wherein the students of the world are empowered to become teachers to each other, and in so doing, co-develop global competencies as they're developing global networks. So, with this broad framing, I would now like to ask Ilka, Catherine, and Richard to join me over here on the stage, and we'll get underway. Okay, so is this microphone on? Great. So I'll introduce the panelists, and then I'll ask for opening statements from all three, and then we'll move into the question and answer. So Ilkka Tuomi is, and maybe before I start that, as you'll see, we're going to traverse an arc here. We're going to go from theory to practice to a little both in technology. So, so we'll start with the theory. We'll talk about practice and content, and then we'll hear from Richard on the technology. So Ilkka Tuomi is the founder of Meaning Processing, and is known, among other things, as one of the pioneers of the internet in Finland, and particularly well known for his research on open source innovation models. Catherine Guji is the project director of OER Africa, and this is an initiative of SADI, which is the South African Institute for Distance Education. Richard Beranek is the founder of the Connections Project, which is the world's, I think safe to say, the world's largest OER repository, or I'll assert that now, and also is a professor of computer science at Rice University. So, and an awardee at this year's WISE 2011. So, kudos for that. Okay, so Ilkka, please start in and let us know a little bit about the theory that we should look to as we consider how to innovate the next generation of education technologies.
Thank you. So I will start with a picture. The theory, in my view, that's always the most useful practical tool if you have the theory, the basics of the theory right. So I will show you this picture. I'm not sure how well you see it on that screen, but it tells you something that no computer will ever be able to see. If you look at the picture for a while, you can see dots coming and going. And you know, we could have a science of dynamics of dots, and we could write a Wikipedia article on dots. And we could even go and write a textbook. What you see in this picture is a very important point for all information processing and for all attempts to digitize knowledge. Knowledge is contextual. We see and know what there is because there is a context of meaning that remains in the periphery and out of our focus. Because that, it is difficult to digitize knowledge. Computers and information systems normally process only the focal and articulated part of knowledge, thus missing its meaning. When we try to store and process knowledge using computers, much of that context resides in our social and physical environment. In tools, architectures, designs, expectations, social arrangements and routines, and conceptual systems. To make sense of computerized knowledge, we need a lot of knowledge. A child learns by borrowing eyes, ears, hands, and sense-making capacity from his or her parents. Novice open source developers become experts by seeing over the shoulder what the others have learned and by participating in their learning processes. Nobel laureates get Nobel Prizes by working with people who already have thoughts. Skills and knowledge do not reside in individual heads or bodies. We borrow cognitive capabilities from our social and material environment to get things done in a competent way. In the process, we learn. This is why the social dimension of the internet is critically important for learning, and why the net is a revolutionary force. Internet is built from computers and it moves bits. But it is not a data processing system, it is a communication medium. Yes, it also allows representation of explicitly articulated knowledge with Wikipedia, dictionaries, encyclopedias, and textbooks. But it also creates meaning through interaction and dialogue, and shifts what was in the periphery to the center and to the focus. It also creates and sustains social networks that can be dynamically mobilized when skill, knowledge, or capability is needed. It creates a social system where knowledge can become relevant and productive, and where innovation can happen. Technology in itself, however, does not generate any specific outcomes. For many decades now, people have tried to change education and learning using computers. They have often failed. Often the failures have resulted from wrong pedagogical beliefs. For example, that learning is about pouring explicit knowledge from a textbook or a teacher's mind to a student's head. Often, however, the failures have resulted from misunderstanding the nature of technology. Here I can speak of personal experience. Computers and other ICTs are what in economic terms could be called composite goods. You can invest as much as you want in computer hardware, but the investment only becomes productive if you make complementary investments in software, skills, incentives, institutions, ways of doing things, and systems of meaning. To create useful outcomes with technology, you have to change the context. Computers and information processing systems are now very cheap. Their quality-adjusted cost or price has been going down for the last 4 decades, almost 20% every year. Basically, computing is now free. It used to be the case that in successful information system projects, you had to allocate about 80% of resources in people and change management instead of technology. And that you used to underestimate that amount by roughly 80%. Now the numbers are probably very close to 90. When the economy and systems of production are increasingly driven by innovation, the world becomes a turbulent place. The emerging world increasingly requires constant innovation and continuous knowledge creation. Educational systems and institutions which at present reflect the requirements of the industrial age need to be redesigned. Why then open educational resources and collaboration platforms are important? Open platforms for collaboration enable socially distributed and continuous learning. They also facilitate social and innovative knowledge and meaning creation. This is about a new and a different way of learning. Or more accurately, learning has always been like that. It is just that during the last 2 centuries, education could not be organized very efficiently or effectively because of practical limitations and because the industrial age systems of schooling had many other objectives than learning. This is why open collaboration platforms will eventually revolutionize education. In the long run, the objectives of educational systems will change. In the industrial age, schools provided predefined skills and competencies and produced decent citizens that can work in factories and keep systems of production running. In the networked world, educational systems will increasingly aim at making nations and societies more intelligent and creative. In the future, educational systems will be increasingly about society-level improvements in sense-making, knowledge creation, and intelligent action. Open educational resources and platforms are the way of the future because they allow those types of learning processes that are increasingly dominant in the future, and already today. Learning will be increasingly peer-based, social, interactive, distributed, continuous, and contextual. and its focus will shift from the upstream knowledge sources towards downstream pools of meaning. Recent innovation research has highlighted this same shift towards downstream and noted, for example, the extraordinary speed at which competencies can develop in open collaborative environments. The OER movement, Open Educational Resource Movement, however, is simultaneously both ahead of its time and stuck in the past. The problem is not really about improving the quality of content that is distributed freely or cheaply using collaborative platforms. That's not the key challenge. Instead of optimizing current content and current educational systems, we need to rethink the social role of educational institutions in the emerging networked global world. To get useful outcomes from OER and to make it productive, the focus needs to be on transforming educational institutions, teacher training and incentive systems, and aligning them with the logic of the emerging networked and innovation-intensive world. Indeed, OER is a revolutionary force, but it also needs a revolution to become real. Innovation and creative destruction require a careful balance between stability and change. This can only be accomplished by visionary leadership and broad engagement by all the stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilkka. Catherine Guji, you're practicing, you're putting OER out there in hundreds of schools in Africa. Tell us your view on what the promise of OERs are for the developing world and what you've learned in your work.
Thank you. I would hesitate to speak for the whole of the developing world, but I can certainly speak to the experience of OER Africa. And I would agree, first of all, with Ilkka that technical platforms, technology itself, does not encourage wider participation in innovative processes, or indeed necessarily encourage wider participation in innovative teaching and learning practices. What we've done over the past 4 or 5 years at OER Africa is to work closely with faculty in African universities. And these are faculty who are committed to improving both the quality of their curriculum and the educational experience of their students. And because of this, they are frequently considering new ways in which different forms of collaboration between peers and across disciplines might result in better teaching and learning. Within higher education institutions in Africa, as in the rest of the world, increased investments in educational technology are more and more the norm, as it is expected that such investments should result in improved educational outcomes. But it is now increasingly accepted that, as it was put by Ilkka, technology itself doesn't generate specific outcomes. So neither the technological quality of an online platform nor its ability to facilitate collaboration is dependent on whether the source coding is openly shared, as would be the case with an open source platform, or if that source coding is inaccessible, as is usually the norm with a platform built using commercial software. So the openness or not of the software built to use the platform is only one in a range of criteria that will result in whether or not the platform is a useful tool for collaboration between networks of educators. So to the question that was asked of this panel, can online platforms, including teacher networks dedicated to sharing best practice and promoting innovation, really provide a means for building the knowledge base, including in less developed countries, or do they simply facilitate the relatively uncoordinated exchange of ideas? The answer is clearly that online platforms might do either. That in fact, the role a platform plays in promoting either a cohesive and well-coordinated sharing of ideas, or instead a jumbled exchange of disconnected streams of consciousness, depends not only on the technical quality of the platform, but more so on the extent to those for whom the platform has been created, constructed, are actually equipped and also willing to use it. In many developing countries, faced with the imperative to educate a greater cadre of professionals, mid-level managers, teachers, doctors, nurses, technicians, and so forth, print-based distance education along with good tutorial systems, good assessment feedback systems. All of these remain critical, even as global improvements in technology have also enabled the development of new forms of pedagogy. And it's within this context that OER proponents argue that open educational resources have the potential to revive higher education standards, to make curricula once more current and contextually relevant, and to foster collaboration and knowledge sharing between institutions, all of which will, or we hope, will benefit the students. And although OER have been defined in many ways, a widely accepted definition is that of materials offered freely and openly for educators, students, and self-learners to use and reuse for teaching, learning, and research. So the essence of OER revolves around that license, an open license that permits the adaptation and the reuse of educational materials without the need to pay license fees. The ability to contextualize resources that might have been created elsewhere and make them appropriate for use in a different environment. So there's not only a potential cost-saving element to OER, but this open license also permits the use of materials without the need to seek the permission of the author, while still respecting the terms stipulated by the author. And those of you who've tried to find the source of a particular pithy quote or wonderful piece of music, it's time-consuming, it's difficult. With an open license, you follow the terms of the license, you're done. And so whether or not one agrees with the OER proponents, it is worth noting that in this digital era, the free flow and sharing of educational content is a global reality. In most instances, it's already too late for faculty to be asking why I should share my content, because the chances are your students have done so already. And what faculty maybe need to focus on is the means by which they might influence how their content is shared, because shared it will be. So whatever the potential of openly licensed educational resources for improving teaching and learning, whatever the potential of collaborative platforms to act as a tool for building the knowledge base, it is people who determine whether or not these technological investments made by an institution of higher education will actually foster collaboration or innovation or even a rupture between the way things were and the way things could be. But if we assume the existence of this perfect open platform constructed to the highest technological specifications, including accessibility to those who live and work in developing countries where broadband connectivity may be imminent but is not yet a reality, then we have to accept that as with any other innovation, there will be both successes and failures in this space. And we also must accept that both the successes and what we choose to learn from the failures will both make a significant contribution to education in all countries. And if we accept that, then we must also insist that to continue to speak in 2011 of lack of connectivity and poor bandwidth as part and parcel of the reality of educational institutions in the developing world is simply no longer acceptable. We have to strengthen the advocacy calls at all levels for proper technological infrastructure and for a level-headed interrogation of the relationships that exist between some governments and some monopoly telecommunication companies that often prevent connectivity being accessible at an affordable rate to those in many developing countries. It's not free. It's not accessible. It's beyond the reach of far too many people. And it is only when we have a commitment to resolve these kinds of challenges that we will be able to facilitate the sharing of intellectual capital, both across developing countries and from those countries with the rest of the world. At OER Africa, we found that when the process of development of OER is guided by a real need for relevant resources, then these processes of creation, of adaptation, have also provided faculty with very practical opportunities to learn or to relearn pedagogical skills, to acquire new technical skills. And they've also served the needs of students to acquire pertinent and applicable competencies where relevant resources either didn't exist or were beyond the financial reach of either the students or the institutions themselves to acquire legally. So in many cases, collaborative endeavor has been integral to these processes. Imagine then how much richer the global knowledge base would be if those involved in such innovative practices in the developing world, as well as elsewhere, those who struggled, as well as those who triumphed, could access an online platform to share with others how they were able, for example, to move from an over-reliance on lectures as a means of delivering the curriculum to a more facilitatory role of guiding their students and encouraging a more problem-based and collaborative approach to their higher education experience, and therefore, hopefully, to the practice of those students once they leave the physical and virtual spaces of the university.
Thank you, Catherine, for your eloquent remarks. I think the OER world is in good hands with advocates such as yourself. The notion that we need to think about educational resources is not simply texts, but as sites where we can share failures, where we can understand how these are being implemented, where we can see the conversations that surround them. It's certainly part of how we need to re-envision an educational resource. So our next speaker, Richard Beranek, has been a part of the OER movement since its inception. His Connections platform, which is administered through Rice University, is certainly one of the profound and important such resources on understanding how OERs have been used to date. And look forward to hearing from Richard on his experiences with that.
Thanks a lot. I'd just like to say before I start that it's great to be here. And I know that the Open Educational Resources movement, the OER movement, has created a lot of excitement over the last number of years due to its potential and promise. And I think I need to thank the Qatar Foundation and WISE in particular for being so supportive of this movement through not just meetings like this, but supporting many different entities that are working in this space. So it's just fabulous to be here and talk more with people about it. So what I have to say, I have a lot of resonance with Catherine and Ilka. Maybe I'll be a bit more cranky. It is a debate after all, right? And I do want to talk a little bit about the not just the opportunity for and the promise for open educational resources and platforms, but also maybe what some of the challenges are and stumbling blocks and where we might be stuck, right? Where we could use some help, right? Where we're stuck. So I think there's no question that this rethinking of the textbook or the course as an open educational resource presents tremendous opportunities, right? Moving from, as Ilka puts it, this factory model of the past to a more ecosystem-based model of the future is really what needs to be happening both in developed and developing countries. There's no question that OERs enable unprecedented access to educational materials, so that's for sure. There's also no question, as you talked about in your introductory remarks, that the fact that OER is remixable, mashable, changeable, will enable every instructor to make the perfect book for their course, right? But really customizing it to the local context, which is really what we need to be doing. And in contrast that to the off-the-rack learning that we have so much of today, just selecting a book off a shelf. And there's also no question that open educational resources allow global communities a tremendous opportunity to speak directly to students, right, and directly to instructors, and involve them in developing and engaging teachers in the not just production of materials, but tuning and improving of these materials. So these are great. These are great opportunities, and it sounds great. I think everybody's probably excited about it. And I think the main question about that I took away from this panel, or the question I've been thinking about, and I'm going to read it again, is whether this promise is really being realized today, right? Is it really being realized? And let me just reread the question here from my notes. Namely, can online platforms really provide a means for building a knowledge base, right? A real sustainable knowledge base, or rather, do they simply facilitate relatively uncoordinated exchange of ideas? And my answer to this to this or question is yes and yes, right? So I think that yes, these online platforms promise the opportunity to build a globally distributed knowledge base that connects people and ideas, but I think also today they're really only providing a means for relatively uncoordinated sharing. And that's what I'd really like to talk about in the debate. So I think the reason is that when you talk about open educational resources, there's really two words that come to people's mind, and I'm going to use the English words, free and open. And I believe that the OER movement, as it moves through education, is really going through two stages. And the first, people are really fixated on free, the free side. And the second, later, people will finally realize the real power of openness, right? I'm not talking about the theorists. I'm talking about the actual practitioners, what's going on the ground. So I'd argue that we're currently in the free stage. And a lot of people who say they're doing open really are just talking about and doing free, right? So the idea is, let's make educational resources with zero cost. Well, this is still exciting. Don't get me wrong, right? This has the ability in the developed world to disrupt the textbook publishing industry, right? Put some pressure on them. And in developing countries, free materials give us unprecedented means for access, which is fabulous. But I'd also argue that the free stage is not about really building these sort of bridges that we need to have global communities contributing to a common knowledge base, right? So the next stage, right, as OER gains momentum, as we gain usage, thanks to the freeness, we'll finally progress on this toward this idea of building this global knowledge base. But there's two big roadblocks, I think, in the way. And this is where I get cranky, right? The first is confusing intellectual property, right? Everybody here knows about open licenses, right? But how much do people really look into these open licenses? If you study the Creative Commons licenses, there are 6 of them. They're virtually incompatible with each other. And I think this is one of the problems, I think, of incompatibility. The second is simple technological incompatibility, that we don't have there's no kind of standardization around how we should share educational materials. There's 60 or 600 different platforms, and with this large number of incompatible platforms, it's not possible to share across them. It's not even possible to search across them very effectively. And I think that this creates basically barriers that make it difficult to create a thriving ecosystem, right? So the thing that I'm arguing is that we're going to get there, right? But somehow there's a lack of, and I'd be the last person to talk about standardization, but there has to be some move towards de facto standardization of people agreeing to work with similar technologies, similar intellectual property, so that we can have a common substrate on which to build open educational resources. And I come back to this later, but I just compare the world like the internet before HTML, right? HTML came along, common standard, the web exploded. Right? GPL for intellectual property with Linux. That's one of the things that helped it explode. So I'm very hopeful that we're going to move towards a world where we can truly develop this common knowledge base, but I think we're not going to get there until we stop talking about just free and move on to talking about open as well as free.
Thanks very much, Richard. So on this question of open source, Ilkka, this is your domain. What does Linux have to teach us, particularly around issues of that boundary between openness and a kernel that's locked down, which, were it open, would lead to complete chaos. So kind of the question is, what does Linux have to teach the educational community, and are there places where that analogy breaks down?
In a way, it links to Richard's earlier point on standardization. That I was looking the history of Linux, the source code, how it actually evolved, and what happened during the history of its evolution. And what was kind of rather apparent from the beginning is that some parts of the system were kind of frozen very early in the process. They emerged simply empirically looking how much there is changes in the different parts of the system architecture. This is software operating system. So looking where there is change going on, you could see that at some point, some parts of the system became some kind of a kernel, core of this much more complex system. And by freezing the interfaces, in a way standardizing the interfaces in this core, the community was able to keep on innovating at the more peripheral areas of this system. But if you would change the core all the time, there would be no kind of solid basis for coordinating work across these different kind of development areas. So that's why I'm saying that innovation requires a careful balance between change and stability. That is not only the case in Linux, by the way, because in organization business strategy and organization literature, we also know that if you run your company either as a research lab or as a pure manufacturer, you will fail, because you have to have these both in a real working business. So you have to kind of separate, sometimes build walls between these different types of processes in organizations to make it kind of go on. So if you go and keep on innovating in those kind of core processes which are really efficiency oriented, you create chaos. And on the other hand, if you don't innovate in those processes which are supposed to renew the organization, you fail, you die out. So there is also this need to balance that.
Yeah. Richard, you wanted to interject?
I just wanted to jump in on that and amplify a little bit on this the question of where does the analogy, how does the analogy work or break down between textbooks, open educational resources, all these, and Linux, right? Software. Yeah. And I let me give a sort of alternate kind of viewpoint of this, and I think that it definitely breaks down because if you get right down to it, Linux software, right, which is licensed under the GPL, is truly open for everyone to use, right, including commercial entities. So the ecosystem is allowed to include not just universities, individuals, but also large companies, right? And you might ask the question of where would Linux be without Red Hat, right? At a certain point in 1999, the company, for-profit company Red Hat, employed fully 50% of the world's Linux programmers. So they lived in a symbiotic relationship, a for-profit company in a $3 billion business today, living in a symbiotic relationship with a thing that's completely open source. One of the things I'm really bothered about in the education world is this use of openness and yet non-commercial licenses around that openness. And I think that this is really dangerous, personally. And Connections also thinks that this is dangerous. And the reason is that it basically shuts out a very large part of the potential ecosystem, right? Namely, all those commercial concerns that do things like print, that do things like build web homework systems, publishers, et cetera. A lot of these entities would really like to get involved in the open education resources movement, but they feel shut out, or they actually are explicitly due to non-commercial licensing. And I think this is actually dangerous because it means we're trying to set up an alternate universe from any universe that involves the private sector, and that ultimately this is going to come to some kind of showdown or fighting in the streets, if you will, over textbooks. And so I would like to see more projects adopting a more ecosystem-based, commercially usable license, that much in sort of along the same lines as open source software. Critical
Consideration, and this is a case where the most open license, the GPL, what Richard's referring to is the fact that when you contribute into a GPL project, anything you contribute inherits that license. So these are also talked about as copy left. They preclude the sort of openness that you have with a MIT or BSD license, where you can contribute into this and not worry about your ability to create. Now, if you raise this topic in any OER mailing list, you better watch your inbox, because this is what really gets passions heated. So while we're in agreement, Richard, or maybe this will spark a few tweets coming out of the online audience. But I'd like to shift a little from theory to practice, and put a question to Catherine. Catherine, you're our embodiment of practice here in this panel, as the one who's doing the work. So, Catherine, I wonder if you could provide some practical examples about how institutional policy might influence whether OER actually becomes an integral part of how educational institutions do their business. What are the barriers there, and what are some examples of successes or failures that you've been involved in?
This morning, Her Royal Highness spoke of education as an imperative, and in the developing world, all across the developing world, it is an imperative. It's not something that we can put off until tomorrow, and in the areas of health, teacher education, agriculture, foundation courses, which are the areas in which OER Africa works, the use of open educational resources is critical. What is happening to higher education institutions across the continent, and probably in other developing countries as well, is that the numbers of students are growing. The faculty are probably growing older. We heard in an earlier panel that many faculty who have remained on the continent or in the developing world and not chosen to join those in the diaspora, for example, are not trained up to the levels that they would wish to be, or that they should be. And that, of course, impacts then on the quality of the education that is possible in those circumstances. And faculty are very, very well aware of that. And so where an institutional policy comes in is possibly around things like materials development, and how much recognition a higher education institution is willing to give to teaching and learning. Universities in Africa, as in anywhere else, talk about teaching and learning as an integral part of their mandate, but really what they're really, really interested in is research and innovation and those kinds of things, outreach. And if you're going to encourage improved teaching and learning practices, if you're going to be in a position where faculty are not obliged to be delivering the curriculum through a lecture because there are not enough other means for students to get their hands on resources, then the sorts of things that Ilka was talking about, passion, become very important. Those faculty who are interested in developing resources that their students can use outside of classroom time, engage with them. I can give you a few examples of that. For example, at a university in Ghana, faculty in the Faculty of Health worked with staff in the School of Fine Arts, which seems like a very unlikely marriage. But what happened there is they decided they would develop DVDs. And DVDs are portable. Students have laptops, some of them. They have access to computer labs. Even if they don't have access to their own personal laptop, they can take this thing, they can go with it, they can sit with it. But what was important was that they were working with the School of Fine Arts for the visuals. So that it was something that was not just educationally sound, which certainly a doctor and a surgeon could guarantee, but was something that actually looked the way it was supposed to look. And then, of course, if you're shooting a video and you are the professor who's been teaching these students for the last 2 years or the last year or so, then it's your voice that the students are hearing, and that also makes a difference. And they were able to report that students who were able to interact with DVDs, say on a cesarean section or a live birth or something like that, were operating and engaging at a far higher level than previous cohorts at the same level who hadn't had access to such resources. It also then, of course, freed up the time of the lecturers to be doing other stuff because they weren't delivering the same lecture week after week, month after month, and they could now, for example, engage with discussions with their students. And it seems like a very small thing, but when you're operating in an environment where you're trying to lecture in an auditorium that was designed for 100 students, and you have 600 students, you have 1,000 students, they can't see, they can't hear. The need for another way of doing things is imperative. What an institution can do then is to recognize that sort of work, to reward the fact that faculty have used their time to develop resources, to block off that time for people to do that, to recognize, whether it's simply through an award ceremony, a public recognition, even if it's not money, what it is that faculty are doing. In some of the institutions that we've worked in, the development of peer-reviewed OER that have gone through the whole system is recognized as at the same level as a contribution to a peer-reviewed journal. These are the sorts of policies that institutions can put into place that will actually encourage their faculty to get involved in OER, because otherwise why would they do it? What it also does then is to create a space for looking at what are the other sorts of skills that faculty need to have if they're going to be engaged in the OER movement in any sort of meaningful way. When you're hired as faculty, you're hired as on the basis of your subject matter expertise. You're not hired, nobody asks you if you're a great teacher. You never had to acquire pedagogical skills to get that post in the first place. So that's something that policies can look into. If you have never had broadband, if it takes 5, 10, 50 minutes to open an email, you are never going to surf the web. You're just not going to do it because that is not the way you're going to choose to use your time. If you don't use your time that way, you're not necessarily going to learn the way that some of us have learned how to use a search engine by trial and error, because you never had that opportunity. And so, again, if you have an institutional policy that insists that faculty will be provided with a laptop, they will have connectivity provided by the institution, and they will be facilitated and supported in using it, so that you're not being made to feel foolish about it if you've never done it before, but that the IT department's role also changes from simply being the guys who provide the hardware and service it, to actually walking you through, these are the kinds of things you can do that might be of benefit to you if you're interested in using educational technology in your classes. So these are the sorts of things that we've been doing in universities. At a national level, of course, policy has a different dimension. And if governments are not aligning educational policy to the particular needs of their countries, if they are still operating as though it's still 1972, it's not very useful. And going back to the drawing board and thinking about what is it that we want our educational system to do, and therefore what are the sorts of skills that we need in the areas of health, in the areas of agriculture. Why is it that every time there is a drought, there is also famine? And yet we have had institutions of higher education that are supposed to be training agriculturalists and have been doing so for the last 50 years. Why are we still dependent on small-scale farming, and these farmers are not being able to move from the level of subsistence farming or something a bit better to being able to grow enough food that will feed the country and feed their neighboring countries, so that we're not having the sorts of situations that we're having now in Kenya and Somalia, where people are hungry, and we knew that they were going to be.
Learning outcomes measured in terms of the ability for a society to feed itself. Profound. Great question from the audience that I'll forward, and perhaps, Richard, you could take this. And if you'd like to identify yourself, please do. the question reads, a lot of talk of OER, but collaboration takes shape in many different types of human activities. Is OER where we should be spending our energy, or should we take more of a practice mentorship approach? I think some of what you were talking about in your last response, Catherine, and focus more on simply connecting, and the question says people, but I think teachers and teachers, students and students, classrooms and classrooms. Richard, what do you think?
That's a great question, and I have a simple answer. I just view open educational resources as some kind of foundational bedrock on which we need to rest in order to invent these new kinds of structures. And I think there's no question that we want to get teachers talking to each other from around the world. We want kids to be talking to kids from around the world. But invariably, they're going to want to talk about something, and they're going to want to share something. And so I think the OER is really just trying to put all of that somethings on a firm foundation so that it's very easy to share, very easy to reuse these in different contexts.
And I would just add that also, you know, to that earlier theme, those interactions are OERs, you know, and if we come up with a good way to capture the interactions, I mean, think about how useful Yahoo Answers is, or how often you end up on a forum when you're doing a Google search. You know, that's capturing an interaction. You know, and I think similarly in education, we think about the text as this endpoint. A lot of how knowledge is shared now is conversational. So connecting is, I think, critical, but then think of that connection as itself an OER. Catherine or Ilka, would you like to weigh in on this question of the importance of connecting and thinking of that as a resource?
Well, yeah, basically I just fully agree. The only point I would like to add, so it's really about the interaction, and I also agree with the view that this is about the platform, and you need to have these, what scientists call artifacts, around which you go on and create knowledge. But there is this one point, which is that why this technology is specifically interesting is simply the point I kind of noted in my earlier remarks, that the cost of these technologies has really been going down so incredibly much that we have never seen any other technology that would have had the same cost curve or cost development. So it means that even in those countries that didn't have, couldn't even dream of having broadband connections some 5-10 years ago, it is a reality in the next 5-10 years. So this is simply the economic point, that this is why the technology really is also very important, this specific technology.
I'd like to just add, in terms of outcomes from this sort of connecting students, our good friend Fred Mednick from Teachers Without Borders connected an inner city school in Seattle with failing French language students with a school in Senegal. The data shows that these students went from failing to being high achievers. Their French language skills went from under the chart to fluent and conversational. This is, you know, it's one of the success stories in this sort of global collaboration that we should look to. So.
Okay. Education, at least higher education on the African continent, used to involve travel. You got on a train and you went somewhere. If you were in East Africa, you got on a train and you went to Uganda and you went to Makerere. Then there was the airlift, and students from all over the continent, as African countries got their independence, the US government decided that their contribution would be higher education. And you had all of these people, including the late Nobel laureate, Professor Wangari Maathai from Kenya, who was airlifted to the US and got her higher education and came back and formed the Green Belt movement and did all of those wonderful things. So technology, as you're saying, is a tool that means that you don't necessarily have to travel. You can, but that collaborative endeavor is the thing that's important. That ability for people to connect, to learn from each other, to spark things, and then to take them back to a context where they're very much needed. Technology lets us do that. And if we're still sitting on a continent where we're surrounded by undersea cables that are promising broadband, but they're not actually quite making it into the interior, then that's a problem.
Yeah. So in the spirit of real-time learning, my iPad, or not my iPad, but the theater iPad, yes, is telling me that we've only got about 10 minutes left. We'd love to offer the audience a chance to ask questions. Is there a question over here at the number one?
Yeah, sure. My name is Salahuddin Kandri. I'm from the IFC World Bank. My question is to Richard. You made a clear distinction between the free aspects of this OER movement and the power of openness. And I would like you, if possible, to elaborate more on the power of openness and how it can help moving from this exchange of ideas to the knowledge base. Although, as Catherine mentioned, I mean, this is not really free yet. I mean, it's still far beyond reach in many places on the globe yet. Still, thank you.
Wow, that's a toughie. How much time do we have?
We're out of time.
I'm just joking. No, that's a great question. I think in my mind, if I can try my best, in my mind, I think the real power of thinking about open rather than thinking about free is to change your mindset from a fiscal dollar mindset to an impact mindset, right? To a people mindset. And I think that to me is really the power of open. Instead of just saying, well, we're going to provide as some kind of service, a free service, these open materials. I think that once you can truly move to a world of openness, that's the only time that you can actually both promote and engage a community to push the development of the knowledge further. And I think it also comes in with the previous question that you can really think of. Kevin Kelly, has a founder of Wired Magazine, has a fabulous quote or thesis in his most recent book that ideas are really the connections between concepts, and the ideas are the things that the people are providing, the conversations, and you can just think of OER as really the scaffold of ideas that these open conversations are going to be enriching and filling in over time. And I think that's the most powerful thing about openness.
Right. Okay, so one more question up here in the back.
Hello. Is this on? Yes.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Kim Jones. I'm chairman of Cariki and former Sun Microsystems executive. I'm very interested in the comments around free and open versus commercial. And I fully agree with the comments that it's very important when things are free and open, like they were in the are in the technology world. My context is Java, where there are millions and millions of people using Java around the world, and yet we did sell it for commercial use. In other words, if you were going to embed it in a phone, you had to pay for the license. And of course, there's millions of people around the world who are selling services around Java, which is why it survived and thrived. I also see a huge opportunity to develop commercial services around OER and still keep it open. And I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts on that.
Great question. Catherine, Ilka?
That is a big question. Commercial services around OER. I think that I suppose I can speak perhaps of an experience where we were approached by somebody who wanted to set up, or is in the process of setting up, a brand new university. in a region in Uganda that would be drawing students from Sudan, from Uganda, from basically areas that have been experiencing conflict and haven't had access to higher education without having to travel. And they have a lot of support from the Ugandan government in doing this. So the funding is there. The expectation is that students would be paying, so that is the commercial aspect, would be paying a fee to actually enroll on a degree program. But the open aspect, or the OER aspect, is that the discussions that they've been having with us are around whether we're able to support them in developing and building their curriculum based entirely on open educational resources. And they're not particular about where those resources are coming from, but simply are they licensed openly so that they can be adapted and reused, so that when this institution opens its doors, they are in a position where they have not spent the majority of the funding that the Ugandan government is willing to give them on buying textbooks and filling up acres of library stacks. So yes, I think there are instances where the two can certainly be compatible, because the idea is that there are students who need to be educated and people who are in a position where they have scarce resources and have to make the best possible use of what is there.
Yeah, very good question. And I think question about dual licensing is very interesting in OER case, because education in itself, I mean, dual licensing, normally you have two different types of licenses. So commercial entities have a different license and private users have a different, or non-profit users have a different license. But in the case of education, I mean, what are we talking about? I mean, if I'm learning something, I'm becoming more of something. This is kind of human development, and I'm kind of learning something, I'm becoming more productive. It's in a way, at the end, from the end user point of view, the learner, it is not easy to say if this should be, I mean, if the categories of commercial and non-commercial make any sense. In the case that you have an institution, it may make a difference. But I would also say that the key maybe is really about looking the ecosystem and how to involve, as was said before, how to get the key players of this ecosystem in place. So Java is a good example there. There are different types of ecosystems, so I can imagine that there would be OER ecosystems where commercial players are not needed, and there are. But if you try to replace existing educational systems, I mean, that probably that type of ecosystem is not enough, but you need to have also kind of commercial players in. And then finally, I would like to comment on the question of free and open, because I think this is a terminological issue, but I mean, the terms carry, and this is also cultural. In different continents, you understand different things by free. But very often in these kinds of discussions, free is understood in an economic sense, so no cost. Whereas open starts to have this kind of ring of social dimension. And I think this is critical. I mean, looking from the innovation point of view, innovation research point of view, the critical aspect of open educational resources, in my view, is when you can productively use open educational resources for your own purposes. So it's not only access, and it's not only the kind of cost of access, but it's actually the capability of doing something with these resources. And only then the kind of potential that is in these OERs become realized. So the social dimension is really, social openness is really the critical thing. That's why I've been talking about earlier, the social dimension of innovation and social aspects of this. It's not an economic thing.
Richard, you want to weigh in on this?
That's a fabulous point. And it just reminds me of the big debate in the end of the 90s within the so-called what's now called the open source community, about open source software versus free software, right? Eric Raymond versus Richard Stallman. And there was a big debate exactly about this semantic issue, right? But I will say that no time did they ever argue about whether open source software or free software should be only used by non-commercial entities, right? There was just never even a concept of that. And I just really believe that if we're going to build a self-sustaining ecosystem of OER that lasts for a long time, we have to have private sector involvement. And otherwise, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment later on.
So I think we've come to the end of the panel here, and so I think that taking my closing point from what Richard had to say earlier, that we're very, very early in this open education resource and open education platform movement, and we might be at a transition point between, where maybe we've just found language, maybe we're starting to walk around and bump into things, and the one certainty is that open education resources are succeeding. They will continue to grow, and the platforms and tools that we use to deliver them will need to innovate to meet the changing needs of a global population. So I hope that against this learning objective of inspiration, of breathing in a little bit of a spirit of where we are and what's at stake for the billions who are the global learners, that we were successful. So I certainly think we were, and would like to give my panelists credit for that. So Richard, Catherine, Ilka, thank you so much. Thank you.